The 7 words that blew up my 10-year marriage weren't screamed during a fight. They weren't whispered over a candlelit dinner. They were spoken in the quiet, sterile hum of a Manhattan hospital room, just 3 days after I had a piece of myself surgically removed and given to the man I loved. Thanks for the kidney, he said. Craziest part. I didn't fall apart. I didn't scream, just smile. Cold, tight smile that felt foreign on. Then I picked up my phone and made the call that would start a war. To understand how I got there, you have to understand the life I had before. The life I built from nothing. To the New York art scene, I was Eleanor Hayes, owner of one of the most prestigious galleries in Soho. My husband, Julian Croft, was my star artist, my protege, my world. Our life looked like a magazine spread, a sprawling loft overlooking the city, the constant scent of oil paint and expensive wine, weekends spent in our glass house in the Hamptons. We were the golden couple. But I wasn't just his wife, I was his architect. I found him when he was just a brilliant, unknown painter with more talent than sense, and I sculpted him into a phenomenon. I poured my money, my connections, my very soul into his career. I thought we were building an empire together, but picture perfect life? It was a beautifully framed lie, and I was the last one to know. I'm going to tell you the whole story, how the man I saved was secretly planning my ruin, and how I used his own masterpiece of deception against him. Telling this it's heavy. And honestly, I could use someone to see it through with. If you want to make sure you hear how it all ends, how I turned my deepest scar into my masterpiece, you can follow my story. That way, you won't miss what's coming next. To be honest, the months leading up to the surgery were a blur of Ian's diagnosis. This hereditary kidney disease he'd always downplayed suddenly became the monster inhaler, tired. The spark in his eyes, the one that used to ignite when he'd look at a blank canvas, was gone. He blamed his fatigue, constant doctor's appointments. I blamed myself for not pushing him to take it more seriously sooner. Our beautiful life in the Soho loft felt like it was holding its breath. The silence between us grew louder than the city traffic outside. When the doctor said the word transplant, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was concrete, a problem with a solution. And when I found out I was a perfect match, it felt like destiny, like a sign from the universe that we were meant to fix this, to fix us. I saw the surgery as the ultimate act of love, a way to literally give him a piece of my life so we could start ours over. I imagined us afterward, recovering together in the Hamptons, the sea air healing us both. I was so focused on the fairy tale ending that I ignored the typos in the pages leading up to it. He seemed grateful, of course. He'd hold my hand, his grip feeling a little too weak, and tell me I was his savior, but his eyes were always somewhere else. I told myself it was fear. Who wouldn't be terrified? 2 major surgeries, one for each of us. The risk, the recovery. I made excuses for his distance, for the nights he'd stay up late in his studio, not painting, just staring at his phone. I was the strong one I had to be. The first real crack in my perfect self-made reality appeared on the eve of the surgery. We were in our separate, adjoining rooms at the hospital. The air was thick with that antiseptic smell that always makes my stomach clench. I was trying to read, but the words were just black smudges on the page. I could hear him through the thin wall, his voice a low murmur. I figured he was talking to his brother. But then I heard a soft laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him in months. Light, easy, and intimate. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed myself up, my bare feet cold on the linoleum floor, and walked to the door connecting our rooms, pushing it open just a crack. He was sitting up in bed, his phone pressed to his ear. I could see his reflection in the dark window opposite. He had this secret little smile on his face, private, knowing look that sent a jolt of something cold and sharp through my chest. It wasn't a smile for his brother. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice softer. He jumped, whirling around. The smile vanished, replaced by a flash of pure irritation. His eyes were like ice. He told me it was just an old friend from college, wishing him luck. But the way he said it was clipped, defensive. He ended the call abruptly. I tried to walk over to him, to smooth things over, but he held up a hand. "Can't I have a moment of peace, Eleanor?" He snapped. "This is a lot, you know." It felt like a slap. I retreated to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. A wave of nausea washed over me, and for the first time, it had nothing to do with the impending surgery. I sat on my bed shaking, telling myself I was being crazy, paranoid. Of course he was on edge. We both were. He was right. It was a lot. Forced myself to breathe, to push the image of that secret smile out of my mind. I had to focus on tomorrow, on saving him. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The nurses had given him a sedative, and I crept back in, just needing to see to reassure myself. He was fast asleep. His phone was on the bedside table. As I watched him, the screen lit up. A calendar reminder. I glanced at it, expecting to see something about a post-op appointment. But it wasn't that. The notification was just 3 words and a set of initials. Malibu escrow closes. SR. I stared at it. Malibu? We didn't own property in Malibu. We'd never even talked about it. And who was SR? It made no sense. It was a completely random alien piece of information. But my blood ran cold because I knew one thing with absolute bone-deep certainty. It had nothing to do with an old friend from Luck. He had lied. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but it was a lie, dropped into the most vulnerable moment of our lives. As I stood there in the dark, watching the notification fade from the screen, the first hairline crack spiderwebbed across the beautiful portrait of my marriage. And I knew, as I walked back to my own cold bed, that whatever happened on the operating table tomorrow, something was already broken beyond repair. Waking up from the surgery was like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The first thing I felt wasn't relief. It was a searing, white-hot line of pain down my side. The second thing I felt was the emptiness of the room. The chair by my bedside, the one I had pictured Julian sitting in, holding my hand, was vacant. The flowers on the table were from my gallery staff, not from him. The next 2 days were a blurry, disconnected fog of pain medication and fitful sleep. I'd drift into consciousness, my throat dry, my body aching, and my first instinct was always to reach for my phone. I sent him texts. Hope you're feeling okay. I'm thinking of you. Then, the nurses say you're recovering well. I'd love to see you when I can walk. And finally, just Julian. They all remained there, a series of little blue bubbles sent out into a void. No reply. The nurses were cheerful but vague. They'd come in, check my vitals, and tell me Mr. Croft was doing exceptionally well, that the new kidney was working. They said it with bright, professional smiles that didn't quite meet their eyes. My best friend and lawyer, Maya Singh, came to visit on the second day. She brought me magazines I couldn't focus on and a smoothie I couldn't drink. I remember her face etched with a deep, furrowed concern that seemed way out of proportion. I thought she was just worried about my health. She kept asking strange questions, not about my pain levels, but about... She'd ask if I'd heard from him, her voice carefully neutral. I remember telling her he was probably just exhausted, that men are babies about these things. She didn't smile. She just squeezed my hand a little too tightly and told me to call her the second I needed anything, at all. At the time, her intensity just seemed like a part of the bad dream I was in. By the third morning, I'd had enough. The fog was lifting, replaced by a cold, gnawing anxiety. I needed to look him in the eye and know he was okay, that we were okay. I bullied a nurse into helping me stand up. Every movement was agony. My stitches pulled, my muscles screamed, but I gritted my teeth. Leaning heavily on the squeaking IV pole, I began my slow, painful pilgrimage down the hallway to his room. The closer I got, the more my dread. Then I heard it. Laughed. It was deep and full and vibrant in a way I hadn't heard in years. And it was followed by the light, musical laugh of a woman. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. The memory of the phone call, of Malibu Escrow SR, flashed in my mind. My hand was trembling as I reached his door. It was already slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The scene inside froze the blood in my veins. The room was bathed in the bright morning sun, and Julian was sitting up in bed, looking glorious. His color was back, his eyes were bright. He looked more alive than I'd seen him in a decade, and he was holding hands with a stunning woman with fiery red hair. I knew her instantly. Serafina Reed, a sharp, ambitious art critic who had written a series of glowing reviews about Julian's work, reviews I had personally leveraged to boost his last auction prices. They weren't just holding hands, they were intertwined, her thumb stroking the back of his hand, and the way he was looking at her, it was a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. A look he used to give me back when I was his entire world. Then his eyes flickered towards the door and landed on me. His face didn't register guilt, not shame, not even surprise. It was just annoyance. The radiant warmth he'd been giving her instantly vanished. replaced by a cold, flat. He dropped her. She looked over at me, a flicker of triumph in her eyes, before schooling her expression into one of pity. I just stood there, clutching my IV pole, the cheap hospital gown doing nothing to hide how weak and broken I was. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. And then he spoke. His voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. He looked right at me, a woman with a fresh wound in her side from an organ she had given him, and he delivered the 7 words that would become my new beginning. Thanks for the kidney. Now leave. In that one frozen, finally understood. The secret smile, the unanswered texts, the Malibu escrow. It all clicked into place with horrifying. I hadn't just been mistaken about his loyalty. I had been mistaken about his character, his humanity, his very soul. This wasn't a man having an affair. This was a predator who had just finished his meal, and I was the one who had served it to him on a silver platter. The walk back to my room was the longest of my life. Every step was a fresh wave of pain from my incision, but it was nothing compared to the roaring in my ears. The image of Julian and Serafina, their hands clasped, their faces glowing with my stolen vitality, was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I didn't stumble. I didn't cry. Something inside me had snapped into a state of hyper-alertness. It was like the world had gone from full color to a sharp, brutal black and white. I got into my bed, the thin sheets feeling like sandpaper, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The room was silent. The get-well-soon flowers from my staff suddenly looked pathetic, like mourners at a funeral for a life that, and in that deafening quiet, I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Maya's name. My whole body was not with weakness, but with a strange, cold energy. When she answered, my voice came out as a ragged whisper. Maya. It was Serafina Reed and he's cheating on me. There was no gasp on the other end of the line. Just a heavy sigh, pregnant with a sorrow I was only beginning to understand. Then she said the words that tipped me over the edge of the rabbit hole. She told me it was so much worse than an affair. She told me she'd done that precautionary check on the gallery's finances I'd asked her to run before the surge, just a routine look over. But what she'd found was anything but routine. She said she was on her way. For the next few days, my hospital room became a war room. While nurses came and went, checking my stitches and monitoring my vitals, Maya sat in the visitor's chair, her laptop glowing, methodically laying out the full, grotesque architecture of Julian's betrayal. And I learned that the affair wasn't the disease, it was just a symptom. The real disease was a long, patient, and systematic fraud. For over 2 years, Julian had been siphoning money from my gallery. My gallery. The business I had built with my own 2 hands before I'd ever met. Maya showed me the statements. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, bled out in increments, disguised as payments to a logistics vendor I'd never heard of. The vendor was a shell corporation, registered in Delaware. Its name? S.R. Croft Imports. S.R. Serafina Reed. It was so arrogant, so brazen. They were hiding in plain sight. Then came the next layer. Maya pulled up a property deed on her screen. A gorgeous, multi-million-dollar condo in Malibu with an ocean view. Purchased 6 months ago by S.R. Croft Imports. The memory of the calendar notification, Malibu escrow closes, hit me with the force of a physical blow. They had bought their dream home with my money, the profits from artists I had discovered, from deals I had negotiated, from the sweat and sleepless nights of a decade of my life. But the true depth of the well, the part that made me want to rip out my own stitches, was how he had orchestrated his own success. Maya uncovered payments from the Shell Corp to PR firms, to freelance writers, to critics. He hadn't just funded Serafina's lifestyle, he had funded her career. He paid for her to get placements in prestigious art journals so she could write those glowing reviews about his genius, which in turn inflated the value of his work. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of deceit. He was using my money to build his own legend, all so he could cash out and leave me with the bill. The final piece slotted into place with a horrifying, soul-crushing click. The kidney. This wasn't a tragedy we had faced together. It was his exit strategy. He had known about his condition all along. His plan, Maya pieced together from timelines and financial footprints, was disgustingly simple. Find a successful, established woman in the art world, use her resources to become a star. And when the time came, secure a new organ to guarantee a long, healthy life for himself. Then, disappear with the money and the mistress. I wasn't his wife. I was his angel investor, his health insurance policy, and his retirement plan, all rolled into one. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had harvested me. Lying in that hospital bed, a part of my body literally missing. The grief finally hit. But it wasn't a wave of sadness. It was a tsunami of ice-cold rage. He thought he had planned for everything. But as I stared at the mountain of printouts on my hospital blanket, bank statements, deeds, corporate filings, I realized he'd made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He'd left me the receipts, and I was going to make damn sure he paid the bill. I was discharged from the hospital a week later. Walking back into our Soho loft was the strangest, most painful moment yet. Everything was exactly as I had left it, but it was all tainted. The life we had built, the art I had curated, the very air in the rooms. It all felt like a crime scene. Julian's paintings hung on the walls, and now when I looked at them, I didn't see genius. I saw a series of calculated lies, each brushstroke paid for with my own money. The whole place was a monument to my own blindness. I slept in the guest room. I couldn't stand the scent of him on our pillows. Maya and I had a plan. A brutal one. But it required one thing from me first, the performance of a lifetime. I had to be the broken woman, the victim. I had to make Julian believe he had completely and utterly crushed my spirit, that I was too devastated to fight back. He needed to be comfortable. He needed to be arrogant. Because arrogance, Maya said, makes people sloppy. It didn't take long. 2 days after I got home, he texted. He said he needed to come by to pick up his things and talk through the paperwork. He was trying to sound gentle and apologetic, but I could read the impatience between the lines. He wanted it over. He wanted my signature so he could ride off into the Malibu sunset. I told him to come. I even made it sound pathetic, like I needed the closure. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. The change in him was staggering. The transplant hadn't just made him healthy, it had made him radiant. He was brimming with a cocky, vibrant energy. He was wearing a new leather jacket that I'd never seen before, and smelled of an expensive cologne I didn't recognize. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. And I, with the lingering pain in my side and the dark circles under my eyes, was the losing ticket he was about to discard. He played his part. He walked in, his eyes full of that phony theatrical. He had the nerve to tell me he was so sorry for how this all played out. He said he never meant to hurt me, that his connection with Serafina was just one of those things that blindsided him, a force of nature he couldn't control. He spoke to me slowly, condescendingly, as if I were a fragile doll that might shatter. All the while, my mind was a steel trap, recording every word, every micro-expression. I just nodded, clutching a tissue in my hand, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. I asked him if our whole life had been a lie. He placed a thick folder on the coffee table. The divorce settlement. He said his lawyer had drafted something fair that would allow us both to move on quickly. Fair. I wanted to laugh, to buy myself a moment, to really sell the role. I stood up and walked over to my favorite of his paintings, a huge, chaotic abstract from his early days that I had bought at his very first show. It was the piece that made me believe. This one, I said, my voice cracking. This was real, wasn't it, Julian? Before all the critics and the galas. The art was real. It was the perfect bait. His ego, that massive, fragile thing I knew so well, couldn't resist. He scoffed, a small, arrogant puff of air. He thought I was just a naive, sentimental woman clinging to the past. He walked over and stood beside me, his new cologne making me sick. He told me with an air of teaching a child that art was always about business. He said I only ever saw the surface, the pretty colors, and then he made his mistake. He got sloppy. "You think this is my masterpiece?" he said, gesturing to the canvas. "Eleanor, my most valuable work isn't even in this country anymore. I've spent the last year building a private collection, the really good stuff, for a consortium of European buyers. That's the real end game. You can't build a new legacy on old work." My blood turned to ice in my veins. A private collection. Hidden. Off the books. A whole body of work created while he was living under my roof. A treasure trove of marital assets he had squirreled away to fund his new life. An angle of the fraud Maya and I hadn't even considered. It was the smoking gun. Outwardly, I just let my shoulders slump in defeat. I whispered that I didn't know. I looked utterly broken. He patted my shoulder, a gesture so condescending it almost made me break character and swing at him. He told me to have my lawyer look at the papers and to sign them quickly, for my own good. Then he turned and walked out of the loft, leaving the folder on the table. He left without a single look back, whistling softly as he waited for the elevator. He walked out of my home thinking he had left me with nothing but a broken heart and a stack of legal papers. What he didn't realize was that in his desperate need to prove his own genius, he had just handed me the weapon I needed to burn his entire new world to the ground. The moment the elevator doors closed and Julian's soft whistling faded, the mask I was wearing didn't just drop, it shattered. I looked at Maya, my eyes blazing, and the look she gave me back was one of cold. The game had changed. His arrogant slip-up about a private collection had given us a new critical mission. We had to find it. That collection wasn't just stolen money, it was the ultimate proof of his long-term, premeditated intent to defraud me. It was the key to his annihilation. Our Soho loft, once a home, was now officially a command center. We spent the next several days and sleepless nights fueled by black coffee and a burning sense of purpose. We needed to find a digital breadcrumb, a thread we could pull on that would lead us to a real-world location. Maya handled the financial forensics, cross-referencing every transaction Julian had ever made, while I handled the personal archaeology. I knew his habits, his passwords, his secrets. Or so I thought. I descended into the rabbit hole of our shared digital life. I resurrected an old laptop he hadn't used in years, its fans whirring to life like a ghost from the past. Years of archived emails, cloud drives, and photo backups. It was agonizing. I'd see a picture of us smiling in Paris and feel a phantom pain in my chest, a memory of a happiness I now knew was a lie. I had to compartmentalize, to see everything not as a memory, but as potential evidence. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place. Buried deep in a forgotten cloud account, under a folder titled Old Muses, I found a series of unsent email drafts. They were addressed to Serafina and dated back years, long before I even suspected anything was wrong. Reading them was like mainlining poison. He didn't write about love, he wrote about resentment. He wrote about me. He never used my name. I was always the curator, the patron, or, in one particularly venomous draft, my gilded cage. He raged about how the world saw him as my creation, how every gallery opening, every sold-out show felt like it belonged to her, not him. He described me as a brilliant but suffocating force who had built him a beautiful prison. He wasn't just planning to leave me for another woman. He was planning an escape, an act of destruction to prove that the creation could finally obliterate his creator. It was the most painful discovery yet. This whole scheme, theft, the betrayal, it wasn't just driven by a deep, pathological to destroy me to feel like his own. He didn't just he wanted my legacy in ashes. This new, horrifying understanding of his psychology changed how I searched. I realized he wouldn't have used any of our established systems. I'd always managed the logistics for his art. The crating, the climate-controlled shipping, the insurance. I used a world-renowned, meticulous art handling company. He would have seen them as my people. He would have gone somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere that was entirely his own. With this new filter, Maya and I went back to the bank statements. We weren't looking for the big, obvious transfers to the Shell Corporation anymore. We were looking for something small, regular, and out of place. And then we found it. A recurring monthly charge for $350, paid from a secondary credit card he'd always claimed was just for art supplies. The recipient wasn't a vendor I recognized. It was a high-end, climate-controlled storage facility. Not in Manhattan, in Long Island City. The unit was rented under a name I'd never heard before, James Croft, his late grandfather. My heart started pounding, a heavy, deliberate drum against my ribs. Julian was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't ship a multi-million-dollar collection to Europe without staging it somewhere first. Somewhere secure, somewhere secret, somewhere that belonged only to him. Maya and I stared at the address on the laptop screen. It wasn't a vault in Geneva or a free port in Luxembourg. It was a bland, concrete building just a few miles away, hiding his secret legacy right under my nose. For the first time in weeks, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. It was sharp, and it was hungry. The hunt was no longer digital. It was about to get very, very real. Having a target is one thing, hitting it is another. Maya and I had the address of the storage facility in Long Island City, a single point of light in a vast sea of darkness. But it was protected by layers of steel and law. Maya laid out the brutal reality for me across my dining room table, which was now permanently covered in legal pads and bank statements. We couldn't get a warrant to seize the contents without probable cause that stolen assets were inside, but we couldn't get that probable cause without seeing what was inside the unit. It was a perfect, infuriating circle. We were standing in front of a locked steel door and we had no key. For 2 days, we hit a wall. Julian was too smart to leave a paper trail leading directly to the unit. The rental was under his dead grandfather's name, and the payments were from a low-profile credit card. We needed another way in, a human element. We needed someone who knew the Julian before me, someone from the days when he still had to get his own hands dirty. My mind started churning through a Rolodex of old art world contacts. Most were his friends now, circling him like vultures. But the more I thought about his resentment, his need to erase his past, the more I realized I was looking in the wrong direction. I wasn't looking for a friend. I was looking for someone he had discarded. And then a name surfaced from the depths of Marcus. Marcus had been Julian's first real studio assistant back when Julian's studio was a cramped, drafty room in Bushwick. He was a quiet, talented painter himself, and he'd practically worshipped Julian. He stretched his canvases, mixed his paints, did all the grunt work for a meager salary because he believed he was serving a genius. Then, about a year after I came into the picture, Julian fired him. He told me Marcus wasn't sophisticated enough for where his career was headed. He'd thrown him away like an old paintbrush. It took me a day to find him. He was running a small, dusty custom framing shop in a quiet corner of Brooklyn. When I walked in, the smell of sawdust and turpentine hit me, and I saw him in the back, hunched over a piece of wood. He looked older, tired. The bright spark of artistic ambition in his eyes had been replaced by a weary resignation. He was instantly wary of me, his posture stiff. I was, after all, the woman who had replaced him in Julian's world. I didn't try to pretend. I laid out a carefully edited version of I told him Julian was hiding valuable assets in a divorce, that he had cheated me, and that I believed he was storing paintings in a secret location. I didn't ask him to help me. I simply said, "He used you, Marcus." And then he used me. I just want to prove what he is. He was silent for a long time, sanding the edge of the frame. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of that old fire. He told me Julian was the most paranoid man. He was obsessed with backups, with having multiple ways out of any situation. In the old studio, Julian had a physical key, but he also had a digital keypad and was terrified of forgetting the code. So he hid it. He saved it in a simple text file on his computer under a ridiculously arrogant file name. That was his method. Hide his secrets in plain sight, masked by ego. My heart leaped. Marcus was the ally I needed. He had given me the blueprint for how to find it. I raced back to the loft. My mind I went straight to the old laptop, the one I'd been digging through. Before, I was looking for invoices, for names, for manifests. Now, thanks to Marcus, I was looking for a password file disguised as an act of ego. What would Julian name the file that held the key to his secret? I started searching for file names. My legacy, nothing. Masterpiece, nothing. Then I typed in a new search term, thinking of the way he saw himself, the hero of his own story. I searched for kingdom. One file, a simple TXT doc, key to the kingdom.txt. Hands were shaking as I clicked on it. Inside was a short string of text, a 6-digit gate code, a unit number 730, and an 8-digit keypad code for the unit itself. It was all there. I felt a surge of triumph so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. We had it. We could get in. I called Maya over to the screen, a grin spreading across my face. But her expression wasn't triumphant. It was grim. "That gets us past the gate, Eleanor," she said, her voice low and serious. "But the second you step inside that unit, you're on a legal tightrope. We can't move anything. We can't touch anything. We get one chance to document what's in there, and it has to be so perfect, so irrefutable, that a judge can't just throw it out of court. This isn't the victory, Eleanor. This is just the start of the real battle." Maya's warning hung in the air between us. One chance. This couldn't be a smash and grab. It had to be a surgical strike, executed with such precision that any judge in the country would see it as undeniable. For the next 48 hours, my loft transformed from a command center into a mission planning suite. Maya, in her element, drafted a plan that was both legally brilliant and terrifyingly delicate. We were threading the eye of a very fine needle. Here was the protocol. I, as his wife, had a tenuous legal right to access a shared asset. I would use the codes to open the gate and the unit. However, I would not set one foot inside. The threshold was a legal firewall we could not breach. To document the contents, we hired a third party, Mr. Petrov, a stern old-school art appraiser and authenticator with an unimpeachable reputation. He would act as our impartial witness. His job was to stand at the doorway, photograph, and video record everything visible inside, providing a signed, notarized affidavit of what he observed and a preliminary valuation. His professional credibility would be our shield. The drive to Long Island City was the quietest I've ever experienced. My hands were slick on the steering wheel. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat. The storage facility was a monument to anonymity, a huge beige concrete box under a gray sky. It was the perfect place to hide a multi-million-dollar secret. I walked through the silent, echoing hallways, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing in my ears. Maya waited in the car, our legal lookout. I stood in front of Unit 733, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. I took a deep breath and punched in the 8-digit code Marcus had helped us find. There was a loud clack as the electronic lock disengaged. It was the sound of Julian's world cracking open. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal handle and pulled the corrugated door upwards. It rattled loudly in the silence, and then I saw it. My breath hitched. It wasn't a messy pile of forgotten canvases. It was a private, secret gallery. At least 15 large-scale paintings, his best work yet, were carefully wrapped in professional plastic sheeting, leaning in neat rows. On a small metal shelf were folders, likely containing certificates of authenticity he'd forged for his European endgame. The sheer scale of the deception, the sheer volume of work he had created in secret, was breathtaking. This was his soul, his real ambition, hidden away in a concrete box. Mr. Petrov, who had followed me in silence, simply nodded. He set up his camera on a tripod just outside the threshold and began his work with quiet, methodical precision. The sharp flash of his camera illuminated the paintings, one by one. I could hear his low, gravelly voice dictating notes into his audio recorder. Style consistent with the artist Julian Croft's abyssal period, preliminary valuation, conservative, based on visible works, upwards of $3 million. $3 million. A secret fortune he had built to share with her. We drove back to Manhattan in silence, the memory card with the evidence sitting like a sacred object in my purse. The relief was immense, but it was quickly consumed by a new thought. As I looked at the digital photos on Maya's laptop back at the loft, I saw more than just legal evidence. I saw his ego on display, his arrogance, his captured high-resolution photographs. And that's when the idea hit me, a flash of inspiration so clear and so perfect, it felt like it was mine all along. A courtroom was too small for this. A legal victory was too quiet. Julian had committed his crimes in the shadows, but his punishment had to be in the spotlight. He had used the art world as his stage, and my gallery as his platform. It was only fitting that his downfall be a public performance on that very same stage. I wouldn't just sue him. I would curate his destruction. I looked at Maya, the noise in my head finally gone, replaced by a single clear, cold note of purpose. I explained the new plan, the surprise exhibition, the public unveiling, the poetic justice. She stared at me for a moment, the lawyer in her brain probably screaming about the risks. But then she saw what I saw. She saw the art of it. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. She told me it was a masterpiece of a plan. I just stared out the window at the city lights. The city I had conquered to build I said, my voice quiet as steel. I'm going to give him. He's about to become the cautious history of modern art. The days leading up to the exhibition were the calmest I had felt. The storm was no longer inside me. It was a carefully plotted weather system that I was about to. My loft was quiet. The war room had served its purpose. Now, the battlefield was being prepared. First came the silent legal strike. Armed with Mr. Petrov's ironclad affidavit and a mountain of financial evidence, Maya went before a judge. She argued for an emergency injunction to freeze all assets related to the fraud. I remember the moment she called me. I didn't feel elation, just a quiet, satisfying click, like a heavy vault door locking. With a judge's signature, their Malibu dream evaporated. The Shell Corporation was frozen. The accounts were locked. The river of my money that had been flowing to them had just been dammed with concrete and steel. Next came the narrative strike. I'd spent a decade building a reputation in the art world, and with that came a network. I knew which journalists were tenacious, which were discreet, and which had the integrity to tell a story without sensationalism. I made a call. I met with an investigative reporter from the New York Times in a quiet corner of a hotel lobby. I didn't give him a tearful interview. I gave him a dossier, a neatly organized folder containing bank statements, property deeds, corporate filings, and copies of Julian's own venomous unsent letters. I gave him the receipts. I was not the source. The documents were the source. I simply pointed him in the right direction and told him the full story would break at my gallery in 72 hours. The final preparation was the most personal. Using a trusted art buyer as an intermediary, I anonymously purchased 3 of Julian's major early works from collectors on the secondary market, the very paintings that had launched his career. As they were delivered to the gallery, carefully crated and handled with white gloves, I felt a sense of reclaiming my own history. I was repossessing the symbols of a success I had manufactured. The day before the opening, I saw them. It was a coincidence. A fluke of timing. I was in a cab, stuck in crosstown traffic, when I glanced at a sidewalk cafe. There they were, Julian and Serafina. But they were not the radiant, victorious couple I had seen in the hospital. They were ugly. He was slumped in his chair, rubbing his temples, his face pale with stress. She was leaning forward, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of shrewish anger, her hands gesturing sharply. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the language of panic. He was no doubt looking at a bank account with a zero balance. She was no doubt realizing her golden goose was cooked. Their great, epic love, the force of nature he couldn't control, apparently couldn't survive its first encounter with a frozen credit card. In that moment, I saw that they were not a team. They were just 2 separate, greedy people who had made a business, and the deal had just gone sour. They were going to tear each other apart. I told the cab driver to keep going. That night, I stood alone in my gallery. The walls were freshly painted a stark, unforgiving white. The lighting was dramatic. My staff, loyal and brilliant, had followed my cryptic instructions perfectly, arranging the pieces for a surprise retrospective. In the place of honor, where Julian's largest masterpiece once hung, was a new work. It was a massive, beautifully lit, and exquisitely framed photograph of my own body. Of the angry, puckered red line of my surgical scar. It was stark, vulnerable, powerful. I walked over and placed the small, polished brass plaque on the wall beneath it myself. Standing there, in the cathedral-like silence of the space I had built, surrounded by the ghosts of his ambition, evidence of his lies, I felt poised. The story was ready to be told. Tomorrow night the curtain would rise, and the world would finally see my greatest, not the artist I had made, but the truth I was about to expose. The night of the opening, my gallery was unrecognizable. It was packed to the point of suffocation, a glittering sea of the New York art world's most powerful players. Collectors worth 9 figures stood shoulder to shoulder with the city's sharpest critics and most influential socialites. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and nervous curiosity, humming with a single question: what was Eleanor Hayes doing? The invitations had been cryptic, promising only a retrospective of deception. It was a title so brazen it had become the most coveted ticket in town. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in a simple black dress. I felt strangely calm, detached, as if I were watching a film of my own life. People offered me their sympathies, their faces etched with concern. They'd heard the rumors, a sudden, tragic divorce. I accepted their condolences with a serene, sad smile. My performance was not yet over. On the walls hung Julian's the ones I had just bought back. They served as the prologue to my story. But the main wall, the place of honor, held a massive object veiled in black velvet, drawing every eye in the room. In a quiet corner, I saw the journalist from the Times. He watched me, his pen poised. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. The fuse was lit. They arrived an hour in. The crowd parted for them not with reverence, but with a morbid, electric curiosity. They didn't look like the art world's golden couple anymore. They looked like cornered animals. His face was gaunt, his newfound health already soured by the stress of his frozen finances. Serafina was clinging to his arm, her eyes darting around the room, a desperate, hunted look, usual smug confidence. They had come here for a conference. They thought they were walking into a fight with a scorned woman. They had no idea they were walking into their own eulogy. As they pushed their way towards me, their faces a mask of righteous fury, I stepped up to the small podium my staff had placed in the center of the room. A hush fell. The show was beginning. I tapped the microphone, the small sound echoing in the sudden, vast silence. I started softly, my voice even, and I welcomed them all. I spoke about the power of art, its ability to tell our deepest truths, to capture a single, defining moment in a life. I gestured to Julian's paintings on the walls, acknowledging the talent I had once nurtured. Then, my voice hardened just a fraction. I told them that while an artist's journey is often public, their greatest masterpiece is almost always intensely personal. And that tonight, I was breaking with tradition. I was unveiling not just a new work, but a new... I gave a small nod to my gallery assistant standing by the veiled object. With a smooth pull, the black velvet fell away. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. There, illuminated in a brilliant, unforgiving light, was the photograph of my scar. It was massive, artistic, and brutal, a raw red line against the pale skin of my torso. It was a landscape of pain and survival. The crowd was stunned into utter silence, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and dawning horror. I saw Julian's face. The color drained from it, his jaw slack with disbelief. He looked at the photograph, utterly uncomprehending. I let the testament to a story no one yet understood. Then, I leaned into the microphone and did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, clear precision of a surgeon. I told them about a brilliant artist. I told them about a secret illness and a life-saving gift. And then I told them about the price of that gift. I spoke of a shell corporation named S.R. Croft Imports. I spoke of a multi-million-dollar condo in Malibu. I spoke of a secret collection of masterpieces hidden in a storage unit in Queens, valued at over $3 million. I laid out the anatomy of a grand deception, piece by painful piece, for the entire world to hear. Julian stood frozen, his face a grotesque canvas of dawning ruin. Serafina had gone white as a sheet, her hand slipping from his arm as she took a half step away from him, an instinctive act of self-preservation. I saved my final lines. I looked directly into his eyes, pinning him in place across the crowded room. My voice dropped to an intimate, piercing whisper that the microphone carried to... Julian Croft always said that he put his entire being into his art. I said, I just never realized he meant a piece of mine. The flashbulbs were like lightning strikes in the dead, tomb-like quiet of the gallery. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't thrown a glass. I hadn't cried. I had simply curated in the stunning, absolute silence of the room. As I watched the man I once loved get publicly and professionally dissected, I knew my masterpiece was the silence that followed my final words in the gallery was the most profound sound I have ever heard. It was a silence of absolute shocking clarity. In that moment, Julian Croft the artist ceased to exist. He was replaced by Julian Croft the con man, the cautionary tale, the punchline. His and Serafina's exit was not dramatic. There was no screaming. They simply turned and walked through the stunned, parting crowd, their faces ashen. The flashes from 100 cell phone cameras followed them like a swarm of angry fireflies, documenting not an arrival, but an erasure. The New York Times article was online by sunrise. It was a masterpiece of journalistic precision, laying out the cold, hard facts of the fraud, substantiated by the evidence I had provided. It went viral before the morning rush hour was over. The story wasn't just art world gossip, it was a parable of greed and deception that resonated everywhere. My gallery was inundated with calls, not from collectors, but from other women sharing their own stories of betrayal. I had spoken for myself, but it seemed I had given voice to many. The fallout for them was swift and total. The district attorney, armed with Maya's evidence and immense public pressure, filed a host of criminal charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny. The art world, which worships success but abhors a scandal that affects market value, excommunicated him instantly. Galleries that held his work saw its value plummet overnight. Collectors quietly moved his paintings from their walls to their vaults. His name became toxic. Serafina's career was annihilated. I heard through the legal grapevine that she turned on him completely, offering testimony in exchange for a plea deal, their grand passion dissolving under the harsh fluorescent lights of an interrogation room. The divorce was a simple, sterile affair. Our ironclad prenup, combined with his felony-level fraud, meant he had no claim to anything. The Malibu condo was liquidated by the courts, and the money funneled back into my gallery's accounts. He lost everything because, in truth, he had never owned any of it. The last I heard of him was from a friend who had been on vacation in California. She sent me a blurry cell phone picture. It was Julian, older looking and heavier, sitting on a stool on the Santa Monica Pier, a cheap easel in front of him. He was selling charcoal caricatures to tourists. The hands that I had once insured for millions were now drawing cartoons for $20 a pop to pay his legal fees. It was a pathetic end, but I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, just nothing. He was no longer a part of my story. My story was now about my own restoration. The exhibition, a retrospective of deception, became the most successful in my gallery's history. People came from all over the world, not just to see the art, but to stand before the photograph of my scar. It became an icon, a symbol of turning a wound into a weapon and then into a work of art. For months, I looked at that photograph and felt a sense of victory. It was the proof that I had won. But one quiet afternoon, as I stood alone in the gallery, I looked at it and saw something new. The rage had finally subsided, the need for revenge had been satisfied, and in the quiet that was left, I had a realization. The scar wasn't about him. Not anymore. It wasn't the brand he had left on me. It was the mark of my own healing. The victory wasn't in his destruction. It was in my survival. I realized I had to forgive one last person. Myself. I had to forgive the woman who was so in love that she couldn't see the truth. She hadn't been a fool. She'd been hopeful and trusting. And there is no shame in that. That was my new dawn. I'm still a gallerist, more successful than ever. But my work has changed. I created a foundation funded by the profits from that legendary show that provides grants and mentorship to undiscovered female artists. I spend my days building legacies, not just for one person, but for many. I took the energy I had poured into a lie and reinvested it. I never imagined that donating an organ would be the act that set me. It was I gave away a piece of my body. In return, I got back my entire life, my soul. Here I stand today, more whole than I have ever been, the sole curator of my life, my story, and my art. My story, born in a Soho loft and a Manhattan hospital, has somehow found its way to you. It's a reminder that these struggles, these betrayals, are happening everywhere, in cities and towns all over the world. It makes me wonder who is listening right now, and where my voice has landed. It's comforting to know that we're not alone in our stories. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to see in the comments what city or country you're listening from, just so we can all see how far a single story of survival can travel.